If you've ever wondered why certain people drain you, confuse you, or leave you questioning your own worth, stay with me, because what you're about to hear is not comfortable. But it will change how you see every relationship in your life. This is not about cutting people off, calling them toxic, or walking away in anger. This is about understanding the invisible rules that keep certain people attached to you while slowly eroding your peace. Most people never learn this, and that's why they stay stuck in the same emotional patterns for years. Here's the truth no one tells you early enough: the people who hurt you the most are often the ones who benefit the most from your silence, your patience, and your willingness to explain yourself. They don't stay because they care. They stay because you keep giving them access to your time, your emotions, and your energy. And the moment you change that, everything changes. What makes this dangerous is that toxic dynamics don't look toxic at first. They disguise themselves as loyalty, honesty, love, or just the way someone is. Slowly, almost invisibly, you start carrying emotional weight that was never meant to be yours. You start managing other people's moods. You start shrinking to avoid conflict. You start explaining things that don't require an explanation. And here's the part that should stop you in your tracks. If someone only feels close to you when you are confused, reactive, or doubting yourself, that connection is not real. It is conditional. It survives on your emotional labor. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly why certain people entered your life, why they stayed, and why they will disappear the moment you stop playing the role they need you to play. And once you see it, you won't be able to unsee it. Let's slow this down, because this is where most people misunderstand the problem. They think toxic people stay because they are intimidating, manipulative geniuses, or emotionally powerful. That's comforting to believe, because it makes you feel like a victim of something larger than you. But the truth is quieter and far more uncomfortable. Toxic people do not stay because they have power. They stay because they have access. Access to your time, access to your attention, access to your emotional explanations, access to your need to be seen as reasonable, kind, fair, and understood. If you remove the access, the power evaporates. Psychologically speaking, toxic behavior only functions in a system where emotional reactions are available. There must be something to pull on. There must be something to provoke. There must be something to destabilize. And that something is usually your instinct to explain yourself when you feel misunderstood. Notice how this works in real life. A toxic person questions your intentions. You feel the urge to clarify. They twist your clarification. You explain again. They escalate. You try harder to be understood. At no point does clarity end the cycle. It feeds it. This isn't because you're bad at communicating. It's because communication is not the goal on the other side. Control is. Most people don't realize that the need to be understood is one of the most exploitable psychological traits a human being can have. It's noble. It's human. But in the wrong hands, it becomes a leash. The more you feel compelled to justify yourself, the more information you hand over. And information is leverage. Your tone, your timing, your emotional triggers, your values. A toxic person learns you by watching how you react when you feel challenged. That's why debates with toxic people feel endless. They are not trying to arrive at truth. They are mapping your emotional terrain. Once you understand this, something clicks. You realize you've been bringing logic to a power game, and logic never wins a power game. The most destabilizing thing you can do to a toxic dynamic is to become emotionally unavailable for manipulation. Not cold, not rude. Unavailable means you no longer feel responsible for correcting false narratives about you. Unavailable means you stop chasing closure that only benefits the person who keeps reopening the wound. Unavailable means you decide that your internal clarity matters more than external validation. Here's the philosophical shift that changes everything. You don't owe everyone access to your inner world. Understanding is not a human right. It is a privilege earned through respect. When you begin to live from that truth, your behavior changes without effort. You speak less, but with more precision. You respond instead of react. You let misunderstandings exist without trying to fix them. And this is where toxic people begin to unravel, because they rely on you filling the silence. They rely on your discomfort with tension. They rely on your belief that being calm means explaining yourself. When you stop doing that, They feel exposed, they feel powerless, they feel irrelevant, and they will test you. They'll escalate. They'll accuse you of changing. They'll say you're distant, arrogant, cold, or difficult. What they're really saying is, I no longer have access. Access is oxygen to toxic behavior. Take it away and there is nothing left to fuel the fire. This is why boundaries alone aren't enough. You can say all the right words and still leak access through your behavior. You can state limits and then undermine them by explaining why you set them. True boundaries are not defended. They are lived. And living them requires a certain inner discipline. The discipline to tolerate being misunderstood. The discipline to let someone be uncomfortable with your silence. The discipline to choose peace over proving your point. This is not passive behavior. It is deeply intentional. It is the choice to stop auditioning for approval from people who benefit from your self-doubt. It is the decision to remove yourself as a resource for dysfunction. And something remarkable happens when you do this consistently. Not instantly, but inevitably. Toxic people begin to disengage. Conversations shorten. Conflicts lose intensity. Their interest fades, not because you pushed them away, but because there is nothing left to pull. And here's the part that surprises most people. When you remove access, you don't become less compassionate. You become more precise with your compassion. You stop pouring empathy into places where it is weaponized. You redirect it toward relationships where it can actually grow. That's maturity. So if you're wondering why certain people drain you, provoke you, or leave you feeling constantly on edge, ask yourself one honest question. Where am I giving access that hasn't been earned? Because the moment you answer that, the solution becomes obvious. You don't need to confront. You don't need to explain. You don't need to convince. You need to close the door gently, firmly, and without apology. And when you do, you'll discover something powerful. Peace doesn't come from fixing people. It comes from no longer giving broken behavior a place to sit in your life. Once you understand that access is the real currency, the next realization becomes unavoidable. The way you respond matters more than what you say. And this is where most people sabotage themselves without realizing it. They believe strength looks like confrontation. They believe boundaries must be loud, emotional, and perfectly articulated. They believe silence means weakness. But psychologically, silence paired with clear boundaries is one of the most powerful forms of self-control a person can demonstrate. Toxic people are not confused by your boundaries, they are offended by them. And offense is often a cover for lost control. When you argue, explain, or defend, you step into their arena. You accept their framing. You let them dictate the emotional tempo of the interaction. Silence refuses that invitation. This doesn't mean you disappear or become passive. It means you choose when and how you engage. It means you respond without emotional urgency. There is a critical difference between reacting and responding. Reaction is impulsive and emotional. Response is deliberate and calm. Toxic dynamics thrive on reaction because reaction reveals leverage. Tone changes. Defensiveness shows up. The need to be right becomes visible. Silence interrupts that cycle. When you don't immediately respond to provocation, the other person is forced to sit with themselves. And that's uncomfortable for anyone who relies on external chaos to regulate their emotions. Most people rush to fill silence because silence feels like loss of control. But silence is only uncomfortable when you believe you must manage other people's perceptions of you. Here's the truth that frees you. You are not responsible for managing someone else's emotional experience of your boundaries. If someone becomes angry because you didn't explain yourself, that anger belongs to them. If someone feels dismissed because you didn't engage, that feeling is theirs to process. Silence does not create conflict. It reveals where conflict already existed. Boundaries communicated calmly, without excessive detail, shift the power dynamic immediately. Not because they intimidate, but because they remove emotional supply. A short, neutral response does more than a 10-minute explanation ever could. A pause does more than a raised voice. Consistency does more than confrontation. This is why toxic people escalate when they sense silence. They raise the stakes. They provoke harder. They test limits. They are not confused. They are checking to see if the boundary is real. And this is where discipline matters. Silence only works when it is paired with consistency. If you stay calm once but react the next time, the pattern resets. The message becomes unclear. But when silence is steady, When boundaries are upheld without emotional leakage, something changes. The other person realizes there is nothing to work with, no emotional hooks, no justifications to twist, no reactions to feed on. This is not avoidance. It is containment. You are containing your energy, your time, your emotional bandwidth. Philosophically, this is about reclaiming agency. You stop living in response to other people's behavior and start living in alignment with your values. And values don't argue. They don't perform, they simply exist. Silence becomes a form of self-respect when it is chosen consciously, not as punishment, not as manipulation, but as clarity. You speak when there is something meaningful to say. You disengage when there is nothing meaningful to gain. That discernment is what toxic people cannot tolerate, because manipulation requires noise. It requires constant interaction. It requires emotional turbulence. Calm, grounded silence disrupts all of it. This is why emotionally mature people are often labeled cold by those who cannot control them. The accusation is not about lack of care. It is about lack of access. And access, once removed, changes the entire dynamic. Over time, the absence of reaction rewires the relationship. Arguments shrink. Drama loses momentum. Some people leave entirely. Not because you pushed them away, but because there is no longer an emotional return on investment. And that is the quiet power of silence with boundaries. It does not need to announce itself. It does not need validation. It works in the background, reshaping your life. Here's the reflection I want you to sit with. If someone only feels connected to you when you are emotionally activated, that connection is not healthy. You do not owe chaos your voice. You do not owe manipulation your energy. You do not owe disrespect an explanation. The moment you learn to pause, to breathe, and to choose calm over reaction, you take back control. And the most powerful part is this. When you stop reacting, you don't lose yourself. You finally meet yourself, because silence with boundaries is not absence, it is presence. At this point, something subtle but profound begins to happen. When you stop over-explaining, when you stop reacting, when you remove emotional access, you naturally begin to live differently. Your standards rise, not because you announce them, but because your behavior changes. And this is where most people get confused. They think raising standards means becoming demanding, rigid, or judgmental. It doesn't. Raising standards simply means you decide what you will no longer tolerate, quietly, consistently, and without apology. Here is the psychological truth most people never confront. Toxic people are not driven away by confrontation. They are driven away by self-respect. Self-respect creates friction for anyone who benefits from your self-doubt. When your standards rise, you stop bending to keep others comfortable. You stop shrinking to maintain harmony. You stop negotiating with behavior that costs you your peace. And suddenly, certain people begin to feel uneasy around you. Not because you are unkind, not because you are distant, but because the unspoken rules of the relationship have changed. Toxic relationships often survive on imbalance. One person overgives, the other overtakes, one explains, the other interprets. One absorbs discomfort so the other doesn't have to. Raising your standards restores balance, and balance feels like rejection to someone who was benefiting from imbalance. This is why toxic people often accuse you of changing when you grow. They say you're different now. They say you're not the same anymore. They're right. You're no longer accessible in the way they relied on. And here's the important distinction. You are not removing people from your life. You are removing the version of yourself that tolerated less than you deserved. The people who were only connected to that version naturally fall away. This is not loss. This is alignment. Healthy people don't feel threatened by your standards. They feel clarified by them. They know where they stand. They respect the boundaries without resenting them. Toxic people, on the other hand, experience standards as barriers, not because the standards are unreasonable, but because they limit control. So they test, they push, they guilt, they criticize. And if those tactics stop working, something fascinating happens. They disengage. They don't leave with closure. They don't leave with accountability. They simply fade. Because there is nothing left to extract, no emotional labor, no endless reassurance, no overfunctioning, just clarity. This is why you must be careful not to chase people when they pull away after you raise your standards. That urge to explain, to soften, to justify is the old pattern trying to reassert itself. Growth feels lonely at first because it removes noise before it adds depth. But loneliness is not the same as emptiness. Loneliness is space, and space is where healthier connections form. Here's the philosophical layer beneath all of this. Every relationship is an agreement, spoken or unspoken. When you change your standards, you change the agreement. Some people renegotiate respectfully. Others walk away. Let them. People who leave because you stopped over giving were never invested in mutuality. They were invested in access. And access is not intimacy. One of the hardest lessons in adulthood is accepting that not everyone is meant to grow with you. Some people are part of a chapter, not the whole story. Raising your standards doesn't make you superior. It makes you selective. It means you value peace over proximity, depth over familiarity, consistency over intensity, and that selection process is what protects your future self. You begin to notice something else as well. Your energy stabilizes, your nervous system calms. You're no longer bracing for conflict or managing emotional fallout. That calm is not accidental. It's the result of removing relationships that required you to abandon yourself. This is why the fear of losing people often keeps us stuck. We confuse attachment with connection. We confuse history with compatibility. We confuse tolerance with loyalty. But loyalty to others that requires betrayal of yourself is not loyalty. It's self-erasure. Raising your standards is an act of integrity. It's saying, I will no longer participate in dynamics that cost me my mental, emotional, or moral clarity. And the people who can meet you there will stay. They won't demand explanations. They won't punish boundaries. They won't disappear when access changes. They will adjust. That's how you know the difference between healthy and toxic connections. Healthy connections adapt. Toxic ones resist. So if people begin to drift away as you grow, don't panic. Observe. Who respects your boundaries without argument? Who remains consistent without access to your emotional labor? Who treats your peace as something to protect, not disrupt? Those are your people. The rest we're passing through. And here's the final truth I want you to carry with you. You don't need to cut toxic people out of your life with force. You simply need to stop lowering your standards to keep them comfortable. Do that consistently, and they will remove themselves. Not because you rejected them, but because you finally chose yourself.